Move along, buddy. Economy boarding isn't for another hour.
Captain Thomas Mitchell's voice cut through the chaos of Miami International Airport's Terminal D like a blade. He wasn't asking. He was commanding. The man in the black hoodie standing near the priority boarding sign didn't move. "I have a seat assignment." "Captain," came the calm reply. Thomas stepped closer, his 4 gold stripes catching the harsh fluorescent light. 25 years of flying had taught him that authority was everything, and right now his authority was being challenged by someone who clearly didn't belong. The man was African American, maybe mid-40s, wearing a plain black hoodie designer jeans that could have come from any department store, and sneakers that were clean but unremarkable. He carried a simple backpack and held a boarding pass in his weathered hands. To Thomas, he looked like exactly the kind of person who caused problems on flights. "Let me see that pass," Thomas demanded, extending his hand. Around them, Gate A-17 buzzed with frustrated energy. Computer systems had crashed an hour earlier, throwing the entire evening schedule into chaos. Passengers clustered around charging stations, their faces glowing blue from phone screens as they frantically rebooked connections. The air smelled of coffee stress and the underlying tension that comes when hundreds of people are trapped in an airport with nowhere to go. But Thomas wasn't thinking about passenger comfort. He was thinking about control. The man handed over his boarding pass without argument. Thomas examined it with the intensity of a detective studying evidence. James Rivera, seat 24E, economy class, paid fare. Everything was legitimate, but Thomas's gut told him something was wrong. In his 25 years of flying, he'd developed what he called his passenger radar. He could spot trouble before it started. Drug dealers, fraudsters, people flying with fake documents, people who didn't belong in first class, people who thought they could intimidate crew members with attitude. This James Rivera fit the profile perfectly. "Economy boarding doesn't start for 57 minutes, Thomas said, handing the pass back with deliberate slowness. "Priority lane is for premium members only." "I understand that," Captain James replied, his voice steady and calm. "I'm just waiting to ask the gate agent a quick question about my connecting flight." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. The man's composure irritated him. In Thomas's experience, people who belonged in economy class showed proper respect when addressed by a captain. They apologized, they moved quickly, they understood the hierarchy. This man was doing none of those things. Behind the gate counter, Sophia Martinez looked up from her computer terminal. At 28, she'd been working for Atlantic Airways for 6 years, long enough to recognize the warning signs when Captain Mitchell decided someone needed to be put in their place. She'd seen him humiliate passengers before, usually for minor infractions that could have been handled with a simple conversation. Captain Mitchell, Sophia called out, trying to defuse the situation before it escalated. "Mr. Rivera is actually... I can handle this." Sophia Thomas cut her off, his voice sharp enough to make her flinch. He turned back to James, stepping closer until he was well inside the man's personal space. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this area is restricted. You need to move along." James looked directly into Thomas's eyes. For a moment something flickered there, something cold and calculating that made Thomas pause. But it vanished so quickly that Thomas convinced himself he'd imagined it. "No problem," Captain James said softly. "I'll wait wherever you think is appropriate." He stepped aside, moving toward the general boarding area with the unhurried grace of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. Thomas watched him go, feeling simultaneously victorious and unsettled. The man had backed down, which was good. But he'd done it with a dignity that felt more like strategy than submission. Thomas had no idea that James Rivera owned the airline he worked for. Sophia Martinez watched the interaction with growing unease. She'd recognized James the moment he'd approached her counter 3 days earlier, though she hadn't said anything to anyone. As a gate agent, She'd been briefed on high-value passengers, corporate executives, and airline industry leaders. James Rivera's photo was in her training materials, along with a note that he was to be treated with special courtesy at all times. But she also knew that Captain Mitchell didn't read those briefings. Thomas was old school, a pilot from an era when captains were treated like gods and passengers were expected to follow orders without question. He'd never adapted to the new culture of customer service, and management had been looking for an excuse to ground him for months. Sophia glanced at her computer screen where James Rivera's passenger record displayed a small notation that made her stomach turn cold. Board chairman, Skyline Aviation Holdings. She looked across the gate area where Thomas was now talking to his first officer, Carlos Medina, probably complaining about the disruption he'd just handled. She wanted to say something to warn Thomas that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career. But she'd tried to intervene once before when Thomas was harassing a passenger, and he'd written her up for insubordination. She couldn't afford another black mark on her record. Carlos Medina had been Thomas's first officer for 8 months, long enough to recognize the pattern. Thomas would find someone he perceived as a threat to his authority, usually someone who looked different or didn't fit his narrow definition of how passengers should behave, and then he'd make their life miserable until they submitted or left. Captain Carlos said carefully, "Maybe we should focus on the pre-flight briefing. We've got weather moving in from the west, and ATC is already talking about delays." Thomas waved him off dismissively. "The weather's fine, Carlos. What we need to focus on is maintaining order. You let one person challenge your authority, and pretty soon the whole cabin thinks they can do whatever they want." Carlos glanced over at James Rivera, who was now sitting quietly in the general boarding area, reading something on his tablet. The man didn't look dangerous or disruptive. He looked like any other business traveler trying to get home after a long week. "He seemed pretty cooperative to me," Carlos ventured. Thomas's face darkened. "That's your problem, Carlos. You're too soft. This job isn't about being nice, it's about command presence. That man was testing me, seeing if he could intimidate me with attitude. Well, he learned today that Captain Thomas Mitchell doesn't back down." Lisa Thompson heard the conversation as she walked past, heading toward the gate to begin passenger boarding preparations. As the senior flight attendant on tonight's flight, she'd worked with Thomas dozens of times, and every flight was the same. He'd find someone to pick on, usually a woman or a minority passenger, and then spend the entire flight making their lives miserable. She'd complained to management twice, filing formal reports about Thomas's behavior toward passengers and crew members. Both times she'd been told that Thomas was a senior captain with an excellent safety record and that customer service issues were handled internally. The second time, her supervisor had suggested that maybe she was too sensitive for commercial aviation. Lisa had started looking for jobs with other airlines, but the industry was tight and she had kids to support. She couldn't afford to quit without having something else lined up. So she endured Thomas's bullying, counted down the days until his mandatory retirement, and tried to protect passengers when she could. Tonight felt different, though. There was something about the way Thomas had confronted the man in the hoodie, something more aggressive and personal than his usual power plays. Lisa pulled out her phone and did something she'd never done before she started recording. James Rivera sat in the cramped plastic chair and opened his tablet to a document labeled Atlantic Airways, Discrimination Incident Report Number 47. For 6 months, he'd been collecting evidence of discriminatory treatment on Atlantic Airways flights, particularly on routes serving cities with large minority populations. Miami to Denver was one of the worst offenders. As the chairman of Skyline Aviation Holdings, James owned 89% of Atlantic Airways, though the acquisition hadn't been announced publicly yet. He'd purchased the struggling airline specifically because of reports like the one he was reading now. Passengers being removed from flights for suspicious behavior that turned out to be nothing more than traveling while black. Flight attendants reporting passengers for aggressive behavior that consisted of asking questions about delays. Captains like Thomas Mitchell treating their aircraft like personal kingdoms where anyone who looked different was automatically a threat. Tonight was supposed to be his final test flight, the last piece of evidence he needed to justify the complete overhaul he'd been planning. He'd deliberately chosen an economy seat on one of Thomas's flights, dressed down to see how he'd be treated when he looked like an ordinary passenger instead of a corporate executive. He'd gotten his answer faster than expected. James opened his secure messaging app and typed a brief message to his assistant initiate documentation protocol. Flight AI 447 Captain T. Mitchell. Preliminary incident logged. The reply came back immediately. Legal and security teams standing by. Shall we intervene? James looked across the gate area at Thomas, who was now strutting around the boarding counter like he owned the place. The irony wasn't lost on him. Negative. Let it play out. I want complete documentation. He put his tablet away and settled back to wait. In his military days, he'd learned that the best way to deal with bullies was to give them enough rope to hang themselves. Thomas Mitchell was about to discover that some ropes were longer than others. The boarding area gradually filled with passengers as the departure time approached. James watched them sort themselves into the invisible hierarchy that governed commercial aviation. First-class passengers clustering near the priority boarding sign, business travelers checking their watches and tapping impatiently on phones, families with children staking out territory near the gate counter. Economy passengers resigned to waiting until their zone was called. He'd flown this route dozens of times as a regular passenger back when he was building his business and couldn't afford premium seats. He remembered the subtle humiliations, the assumptions people made based on his appearance, the way flight attendants would question his seat assignment, or suggest he'd made a mistake when he handed them a first-class boarding pass. Those experiences had driven him to build his own airline, a company where passenger dignity wasn't negotiable, and crew training focused on respect rather than control. When Atlantic Airways came up for sale, he'd seen an opportunity to expand that vision to a major carrier. But first he had to document exactly what was wrong with the current culture. Thomas appeared from behind the gate counter, having finished his pre-flight briefing. He moved through the boarding area with the swagger of a man who believed his uniform made him superior to everyone around him. When he passed James, their eyes met for a brief moment. Thomas's expression was cold and dismissive, the look of someone who'd already written James off as unworthy of consideration. James held his gaze steadily until Thomas looked away. In that moment, he made his final decision about Thomas Mitchell's future with Atlantic Airways. It would be ending tonight. The story of James Rivera began 31 years earlier in a cramped apartment in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood. His mother, Sandra Rivera, worked double shifts at a Ford assembly plant during the week and cleaned office buildings on weekends to keep food on the table and rent money in the bank. James never knew his father, who'd walked out when James was 3 years old, leaving behind only a faded photograph and a pattern of broken promises. Sandra died when James was 19, her body finally surrendering to years of exhaustion and untreated diabetes. The week after her funeral, James enlisted in the Air Force, partly because he needed direction, and partly because he wanted to honor the only dream his mother had ever shared with him, that her son would someday fly above the poverty that had defined their lives. He never became a pilot. His test scores channeled him into logistics and supply chain management, where he discovered an intuitive understanding of how complex organizations functioned. The military taught him discipline planning, and, most importantly, how to see patterns that others missed. By the time he left the service 8 years later, he had a degree in business administration and a plan to build something that would last. James started with a single cargo van delivering packages for small businesses in Detroit that couldn't afford major shipping companies. He worked 18-hour days, sleeping in the van between runs, eating cold sandwiches and instant coffee. Within 2 years, he had a fleet of 12 vehicles and contracts with several major auto parts manufacturers. The breakthrough came when he noticed that his clients were paying premium rates for expedited air freight on small high-value components. James saw an opportunity by a small cargo aircraft hire experienced pilots and offer same-day delivery at half the cost of the major carriers. It was risky, requiring him to mortgage everything he owned and borrow against future contracts, but it worked. Rivera Express Air grew from 1 plane to 5, then 20, then a fleet of cargo aircraft serving the entire Midwest. James reinvested every dollar of profit building maintenance facilities, hiring experienced aviation professionals, and gradually expanding into passenger charter service for corporate clients who valued reliability over luxury. The transformation from cargo operator to aviation empire took 15 years of calculated risks and relentless work. James acquired struggling regional airlines, modernized their fleets, and built a reputation for treating both employees and passengers with a level of respect that was rare in the industry. When other airlines were cutting costs by reducing staff and cramming more seats into their aircraft, Rivera's companies were investing in training equipment and customer service. By age 40, James Rivera was worth more than $800 million. But money had never been the goal. The goal was power, the kind of power that could prevent other people from experiencing the humiliations he'd endured growing up poor and black in America. Thomas Mitchell's story was different but equally defining. He'd grown up in affluent Westchester County, the son of a commercial pilot and a mother who'd given up her own career to manage the family's social standing. Thomas had learned early that status was everything, that appearances mattered more than substance, and that authority was something you claimed rather than earned. His path to the cockpit had been straightforward college flight training, a regional airline job, and then the steady climb through the ranks to major carrier captain. He'd married twice in his 30s, both times to flight attendants who'd been impressed by his uniform and confident demeanor. Both marriages had ended in bitter divorces when his wives discovered that Thomas's charm was a performance he only maintained in public. The third marriage, to a Miami real estate agent named Patricia, had lasted longer, but ended the same way. Patricia had filed for divorce 6 months earlier, citing irreconcilable differences that the court documents translated into Thomas's drinking, his explosive temper, and his inability to treat anyone outside his professional circle with basic respect. At 52, Thomas was facing mandatory retirement in 8 years, with a pension that would barely cover his alimony obligations. He lived in a studio apartment near the airport, drove a 15-year-old BMW that he couldn't afford to replace, and spent most evenings in airline employee bars, reliving his glory days with younger pilots who were too polite to tell him his stories were boring. But when he put on the uniform, Thomas felt like the man he'd always believed he was meant to be. The 4 stripes on his shoulders were proof that he'd achieved something meaningful, that his opinion mattered, that people had to listen when he spoke. He protected that authority jealously, viewing any challenge as a personal attack that required immediate and decisive response. Tonight, James Rivera had challenged that authority simply by existing in a space Thomas considered his own. Carlos Medina watched Thomas pace around the gate area like a territorial animal marking its boundaries. As first officer, Carlos was caught between loyalty to his captain and growing discomfort with Thomas's behavior toward passengers. This was Carlos's first year as a first officer with Atlantic Airways, a promotion he'd earned after 5 years of flying regional routes for commuter airlines. Carlos had grown up in Los Angeles, the son of immigrants who'd worked in restaurant kitchens and hotel housekeeping to put him through college and flight school. He understood what it felt like to be judged by appearance rather than ability, to have people assume he didn't belong in professional settings, to work twice as hard for half the recognition. When Thomas talked about passengers like they were cargo to be managed rather than people to be served, it reminded Carlos of every supervisor who'd ever treated his parents like they were invisible. But Carlos also knew that speaking up could end his career. First officers who challenged captains found themselves passed over for promotions assigned to undesirable routes or mysteriously failed during check rides. Carlos Thomas called, striding over with the boarding manifest in his hand. "Take a look at this passenger list. See anything that concerns you?" Carlos scanned the document, noting the usual mix of business travelers, families, and vacation passengers. Not particularly, Captain. Looks like a pretty standard load. Thomas pointed to James Rivera's name. Economy passenger paid full fare, last-minute booking, flying alone to Denver with no return ticket. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. That's a profile, Carlos. Drug courier, probably. Or someone flying on stolen credit cards. Captain, that seems like a pretty big assumption based on experience. Thomas cut him off. I've been flying for 25 years, son. I know how to spot trouble before it starts. That man we dealt with earlier, he's going to be a problem. Mark my words. Sophia Martinez had been trying to focus on her computer screen for the past 20 minutes, but she couldn't stop thinking about the confrontation she'd witnessed. As a gate agent, she'd dealt with thousands of passengers and dozens of pilots, and she'd learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when a situation was about to spiral out of control. Thomas Mitchell was a ticking bomb, and James Rivera was the match. Sophia had pulled up James's passenger record on her screen, studying the details that Thomas hadn't bothered to check. James Rivera, frequent flyer with Atlantic Airways and 6 other major carriers, corporate account billing, priority status across multiple airline partnerships, and most importantly, a notation in the VIP section that made her hands shake: Skyline Aviation Holdings, Board Chairman. Notify corporate office of any service issues immediately. She'd seen that notation only twice before, both times for airline executives who could end careers with a single phone call. The protocol was clear: VIP passengers received special handling, immediate problem resolution, and whatever accommodations were necessary to ensure their satisfaction. Thomas had done the exact opposite. Sophia glanced around the gate area, looking for her supervisor, but he'd gone to deal with another delayed flight 2 gates down. She could try calling the corporate customer service line, but that would mean explaining that a senior captain had just humiliated the airline's owner without realizing who he was. The conversation would be recorded, and if she was wrong about the severity of the situation, she'd be the one facing disciplinary action. But if she was right and James Rivera really was who his passenger record claimed he was, then Thomas Mitchell had just ended his own career. Sophia made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her phone and dialed the corporate emergency line, the number reserved for situations that required immediate executive intervention. Atlantic Airways Corporate Emergency Services. A crisp voice answered. This is Amanda speaking. What's the nature of your emergency? This is Sophia Martinez, gate agent at Miami International Gate A17. I need to report a potential incident involving a VIP passenger. What kind of incident? Ms. Martinez. Sophia took a deep breath. Captain Thomas Mitchell just confronted Mr. James Rivera in a manner that violated our customer service standards. Mr. Rivera is listed as a board chairman for Skyline Aviation Holdings. The line went silent for several seconds. When Amanda spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. Ms. Martinez, I'm going to transfer you to our Executive Services Department. Please hold the line and repeat everything you just told me. The hold music lasted only 10 seconds before a new voice came on the line, deeper and more serious than the first. Ms. Martinez, this is Michael Torres, Legal Director for Atlantic Airways. I need you to tell me exactly what you witnessed, and I need you to be very precise about the timing and the specifics of any interaction between Captain Mitchell and Mr. Rivera. As Sophia began recounting the confrontation, she had no idea that her phone call was being recorded, transcribed, and immediately forwarded to the offices of the CEO, the head of Human Resources, and the Corporate Security Department. She also had no idea that James Rivera was listening to every word through a secure connection on his tablet. Lisa Thompson finished her pre-flight cabin preparation and moved to the gate counter to begin boarding procedures. As the senior flight attendant, she was responsible for ensuring that passengers were seated efficiently and that any potential problems were identified before they became disruptions. She'd been flying for 12 years, long enough to develop strong instincts about passenger behavior and crew dynamics. Tonight, her instincts were screaming that something was wrong. Thomas Mitchell was more aggressive than usual. his interactions with ground staff sharp and dismissive. He'd made several comments about maintaining standards and keeping undesirable elements in line language that Lisa recognized as coded racism from her diversity training sessions. The passenger he'd confronted, James Rivera, was sitting quietly in the boarding area, reading on his tablet and occasionally making notes on his phone. He looked like any other business traveler, certainly not like someone who deserved to be publicly humiliated by an airline captain. Lisa had seen this pattern before. Thomas would target passengers who didn't fit his narrow definition of how airline customers should look and behave, then escalate minor interactions into major confrontations. Usually the passengers backed down because they needed to get home and couldn't afford to miss their flights. But occasionally Thomas would pick on someone who fought back, and those encounters had resulted in formal complaints, social media incidents, and corporate damage control. Lisa pulled out her phone and did something she'd never done in 12 years of flying. She started recording. If Thomas was planning to continue his harassment of James Rivera, she wanted evidence for the inevitable investigation. James Rivera closed his tablet and looked around the boarding area with the calculating gaze of a man who'd spent years analyzing business operations. What he saw was a microcosm of everything wrong with commercial aviation. Stressed passengers treated like problems to be solved rather than customers to be served. Employees who'd been trained to enforce rules rather than provide service, and a command structure that prioritized authority over accountability. He'd built his own airline specifically to avoid these problems, hiring employees who understood that customer satisfaction was the foundation of long-term profitability. His crew members were trained to de-escalate conflicts, not create them, and his captains understood that their job was to ensure safe, comfortable transportation, not to demonstrate their power over passengers. When he'd acquired Atlantic Airways, James had planned a gradual transformation of the company culture, implementing new training programs and incentive structures that would encourage better customer service without creating massive disruption to existing operations. But Thomas Mitchell had just accelerated that timeline considerably. James opened his secure messaging app and sent another update to his corporate team: incident escalating as predicted. Recommend full documentation protocol and prepare for immediate intervention if necessary. The response came back within seconds. Legal team briefed and standing by. Security team en route to Miami. Corporate jet fueled and ready for departure if needed. James smiled slightly. One of the advantages of owning an airline was that you could always get a flight when you needed one. Boarding began 15 minutes late, the delay caused by a computer system that was still recovering from the earlier crash. Sophia Martinez's voice echoed through the gate area as she announced priority boarding for first-class and elite status passengers. Thomas emerged from the jet bridge where he'd been completing his final pre-flight inspections and positioned himself near the boarding counter like a nightclub bouncer evaluating customers. He watched each passenger scan their boarding pass and proceed down the jet bridge, his eyes lingering on anyone who didn't fit his mental image of a typical Atlantic Airways traveler. When James Rivera stood up and joined the line, Thomas's attention focused like a laser. Zone 3. Boarding hasn't been called yet, Thomas announced loudly, his voice carrying across the gate area. James looked at his boarding pass, then at the electronic sign that clearly displayed, "Now boarding zones 1-3. He held up his pass so Thomas could see it. "I'm Zone 3 Captain." Thomas snatched the pass from James's hand and examined it with exaggerated scrutiny, holding it up to the light as if checking for counterfeiting. "This shows economy class. Zone 3 economy boarding starts after elite passengers are seated. The sign says Zones 1-3 are boarding now," James pointed out calmly. Sophia Martinez tried to intervene. "Captain, Mr. Rivera is correct. We're boarding all zones up to 3. Thomas's face flushed red. "I'll determine the boarding order, Sophia. This is my aircraft." A murmur went through the line of waiting passengers. Several people pulled out their phones and started recording, James noticed a young Latina woman near the front of the line who was live streaming to what looked like a substantial social media following. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" Captain James asked, his voice carrying just far enough for the recording devices to pick up clearly. "There's a problem with passengers who think they can intimidate crew members," Thomas shot back. "I've been watching you, Mr. Rivera. First you were blocking the priority lane, now you're arguing about boarding procedures. That's a pattern of disruptive behavior." Carlos Medina appeared at Thomas's shoulder, his face tight with embarrassment. "Captain, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "There's nothing to discuss," Thomas said firmly. "Mr. Rivera needs to learn that when I give an instruction, passengers follow it without argument." James looked around at the dozen passengers who were now openly staring at the confrontation. He could have identified himself, could have ended the entire situation with a single phone call to corporate headquarters. But he'd come here to document exactly this kind of behavior, and Thomas Mitchell was providing better evidence than James could have hoped for. "I understand," Captain James said quietly. "I'll wait until you're ready for me to board." But Thomas wasn't finished. The public setting the watching passengers and James's calm demeanor had triggered something deeper than professional authority. This was personal now. "Actually, Mr. Rivera, I think we need to have a conversation about your attitude." The boarding line came to a complete stop as Thomas Mitchell stepped directly in front of James Rivera, positioning himself close enough that passengers had to move around them. The gate area, which had been filled with the usual travel buzz of conversations and announcements, fell into an uncomfortable silence as people realized they were witnessing something far more serious than a routine boarding delay. "Step aside, Mr. Rivera." Thomas commanded, his voice carrying the authority he'd cultivated over 25 years of flying. "You and I need to clarify a few things before you set foot on my aircraft." James remained where he stood, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. "I'm not sure what needs to be clarified, Captain. I have a valid ticket, I'm in the correct boarding zone, and I haven't violated any airline policies. Your attitude is the violation." Thomas shot back. "I've been flying for 25 years, and I know a troublemaker when I see one. First, you're blocking priority areas. Then you're arguing about boarding procedures. That's disruptive behavior, and I won't tolerate it on my flight." Maria Lopez, a high school teacher from Phoenix, continued live streaming from her position near the boarding counter. Her phone showed 847 viewers, and climbing as word spread across social media that something dramatic was happening at Miami International Airport. The comments were flowing faster than she could read them. "This is so wrong. Someone call the news. That pilot is about to get sued." Robert Wilson, an attorney traveling to Denver for a corporate merger, stepped out of line and positioned himself where he could clearly see and hear everything. In his 15 years of practice, he'd handled dozens of discrimination cases, and he recognized the warning signs of a situation that was about to become a federal lawsuit. Jennifer Adams, a college senior at the University of Miami, was supposed to be thinking about her economics final exam, but instead found herself documenting what looked like a textbook case of racial profiling. She'd started recording when Thomas first approached James, and her TikTok video was already being shared across multiple platforms with hashtags like airline racism and Flightgate. Thomas was oblivious to the digital documentation building around him. His focus was entirely on James Rivera, who represented everything that frustrated him about the changing nature of commercial aviation. Passengers who didn't show proper deference to crew authority. People who questioned procedures instead of simply following instructions. Individuals who acted like they belonged in spaces that Thomas believed should be reserved for a different class of person. "I want to see some identification," Thomas demanded, holding out his hand. Real identification, not just a boarding pass. James reached into his jacket and produced his driver's license, handing it over without argument. Thomas examined it carefully, comparing the photo to James's face, checking the expiration date, looking for any detail that might justify his suspicions. "Illinois driver's license," Thomas announced loudly, as if this was somehow significant. "You're traveling from Miami to Denver with an Illinois license." That's an unusual routing pattern. I travel frequently for business, James replied calmly. Is there a specific concern about my travel plans? My concern is passenger safety, Thomas said, his voice rising. When someone exhibits suspicious behavior, it's my responsibility to investigate before allowing them on board. Carlos Medina could feel the situation spiraling out of control. He'd seen Thomas target passengers before, but never this aggressively, and never with this many witnesses. The smart move would be to de-escalate, get everyone boarded, and deal with any issues once they were in the air. But Carlos also knew that challenging Thomas in public would end his own career before it had really started. Captain Carlos said quietly, "We're already running behind schedule. Maybe we should continue this conversation on the aircraft." Thomas turned on his first officer with a look that could have melted steel. "Mr. Medina, I'm handling a security situation. Your job is to support my decisions, not second-guess them." Sofia Martinez watched from behind the gate counter, her hands shaking as she tried to appear busy with passenger manifests, while actually listening to every word of the confrontation. She'd already made her call to corporate headquarters, but she had no idea when or if anyone would respond. Meanwhile, Thomas Mitchell was destroying his career in real time and taking the airline's reputation down with him. The line of passengers behind James had grown restless. Business travelers checked their watches and muttered about missed connections. Families with young children looked anxiously toward the aircraft, worried about finding overhead bin space for their carry-on bags. An elderly couple near the back of the line asked each other in voices loud enough to be overheard whether they should rebook on a different flight. But James Rivera remained perfectly still, his breathing steady, his expression neutral. He'd learned this kind of control during his military service, where losing your temper could get people killed. More importantly, he'd learned it during 30 years of being a black man in corporate America, where showing anger, even justified anger, could be used as evidence that you didn't belong in the room. Mr. Rivera Thomas continued, his voice taking on a tone of false reasonableness that made the situation even more uncomfortable. "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly. Are you traveling alone?" "Yes, sir." "What's the purpose of your trip to Denver business?" "What kind of business?" James paused. This was the moment when he could end the confrontation by revealing his identity, by explaining that he owned the airline and that Thomas was interrogating his boss. But that would defeat the purpose of his investigation. He needed to document how Atlantic Airways treated passengers who didn't have corporate titles to protect them. "I'm in the aviation industry," James said, which was technically true. Thomas's eyes lit up as if he'd uncovered a crucial piece of evidence. "Aviation industry? What company? A private company. Private company." Thomas repeated the words like they were suspicious in themselves. "And you're flying economy class to conduct aviation business." "I fly economy frequently." "Why?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, passengers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that they were witnessing something that went far beyond normal airline security procedures. This was an interrogation conducted in public without justification or probable cause. Robert Wilson stepped forward. "Excuse me, Captain, but I'm an attorney, and what you're doing right now could be construed as harassment. This passenger has provided identification. He has a valid ticket, and he's answered your questions politely. Unless you have specific evidence of wrongdoing, you need to allow him to board." Thomas turned his attention to Robert with the cold fury of someone whose authority has been challenged by an outsider. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to step back and mind your own business. This is an airline security matter." "Actually, it's not," Robert replied calmly. "Airline security is handled by federal agents, not pilots. You're conducting an interrogation based on what appears to be racial profiling, and this entire interaction is being recorded by multiple passengers." For the first time, Thomas looked around the gate area and noticed the phones pointed in his direction. The recording devices didn't deter him, they enraged him. In his mind, these passengers were witnessing his authority being undermined, and he needed to reassert control immediately. "Mr. Rivera Thomas," said his voice becoming harsh and official, I'm ordering you to step aside for additional screening. Your behavior has been disruptive. Your answers have been evasive, and I have reasonable suspicion that you may pose a security threat to this flight." The gate area fell completely silent. Even the background noise of airport announcements and rolling luggage seemed to pause as passengers processed what they'd just heard. Thomas Mitchell had just officially accused James Rivera of being a terrorist threat. James felt something cold settle in his chest, a familiar sensation from his military days when situations moved beyond diplomacy into the realm of inevitable conflict. He'd given Thomas multiple opportunities to step back to de-escalate to simply treat him like any other passenger. Instead, Thomas had chosen to double down on his prejudice and make it official. Captain James said, his voice still calm but carrying a new edge, "I want to be very clear about what's happening here. Are you refusing to allow me to board this flight? I'm conducting a security investigation," Thomas replied. "Until that investigation is complete, you will not be boarding this aircraft." Maria Lopez's live stream now had over 3,000 viewers. The comments were exploding with outrage, legal analysis, and calls for people to share the video across every social media platform. Someone had identified the flight number and was posting Atlantic Airways customer service phone number, encouraging viewers to call and complain. Jennifer Adams had switched from TikTok to Instagram Live, where her video was being watched by students from universities across the country. The hashtag Atlantic Airways Racism was trending on Twitter, with new posts appearing every few seconds. But the most important recording was happening on a device that none of the passengers could see. James Rivera's tablet, which he'd left running in his backpack, was connected to a secure server that was transmitting everything to Skyline Aviation's corporate headquarters, where teams of lawyers, executives, and public relations specialists were watching the disaster unfold in real time. Lisa Thompson emerged from the jet bridge, having completed her cabin preparation duties. She immediately sensed the tension in the gate area and saw the crowd of passengers clustered around Thomas and James. As she approached, she could hear Thomas demanding to search James's carry-on bag. Captain Lisa said quietly, "Is there a problem? Passengers are starting to ask questions about the delay." Thomas turned to her with the expression of a general briefing a subordinate on a military operation. "Ms. Thompson, I need you to call airport security. We have a passenger who's refusing to cooperate with screening procedures." Lisa looked at James Rivera, who was standing calmly with his hands visible and his backpack on the ground beside him. He wasn't arguing, wasn't raising his voice, wasn't exhibiting any of the behaviors she'd been trained to identify as threatening or disruptive. "What kind of screening issue?" she asked. "This individual has been evasive about his travel plans, hostile toward crew instructions, and he's traveling on a suspicious ticket pattern," Thomas explained. "I want him removed from the gate area before he can board." Lisa had worked with Thomas long enough to recognize the signs of one of his episodes. He'd found a target, usually someone he perceived as not belonging in his social circle, and he'd escalated a minor interaction into a major confrontation. She'd seen him do it to passengers, flight attendants, gate agents, and ground crew members. The pattern was always the same. Thomas would find a reason to assert his authority, then interpret any resistance as justification for further escalation. Captain Lisa said carefully, "Maybe I should call the duty manager instead of security. Let them evaluate the situation." Thomas's face darkened. "Ms. Thompson, I gave you a direct instruction. Are you refusing to follow it?" The threat was clear. Lisa could call security as ordered and become complicit in what was obviously harassment, or she could refuse and face disciplinary action for insubordination. Either choice would have consequences for her career. But as she looked around the gate area at the passengers recording everything with their phones, at the growing crowd of people who were obviously sympathetic to James Rivera, Lisa realized that the biggest risk to her career might be following Thomas's orders. "I'll call the duty manager," she said firmly. "They can determine if security is needed." Thomas stepped toward her, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Lisa, you're making a career-ending mistake right now." "Maybe," Lisa replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. but I'm not going to help you destroy an innocent passenger." She pulled out her radio and called the duty manager, clearly stating that they had a crew-passenger conflict at Gate A17 that required immediate supervision. The call was logged and recorded, creating another piece of evidence in what was rapidly becoming a corporate catastrophe. James Rivera had been waiting for this moment, the point when Thomas would cross the line from harassment into something that would require legal action. He'd given Thomas every opportunity to step back, to treat him with basic human dignity, to simply do his job as a professional airline captain. Instead, Thomas had chosen to make this personal. James reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his business phone, a device that looked unremarkable but was connected to some of the most powerful people in the aviation industry. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. Patricia Hayes, CEO of Atlantic Airways. The call was answered on the first ring. "Patricia, this is James Rivera. I'm at Gate A17 in Miami, and I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." Thomas was close enough to hear James speaking but couldn't make out the words. What he could see was that James was no longer behaving like a passenger being questioned by authority. His posture had changed, becoming more commanding, more confident. His voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone who is accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them. For the first time since the confrontation began, Thomas felt a flutter of uncertainty. "Who are you calling?" Thomas demanded. James finished his phone conversation and looked directly into Thomas's eyes. "I just spoke with your CEO." Thomas laughed, but it sounded forced and hollow. "Right. You've got the CEO of Atlantic Airways on speed dial." "Actually, I do." The certainty in James's voice made Thomas pause. Around them, the gate area had become completely focused on their confrontation. Passengers had stopped pretending to mind their own business and were openly watching the drama unfold. Several people had their phones out, and Thomas could see that at least 3 different live streams were broadcasting the interaction. "Let me see that phone," Thomas demanded. "No." The single word hit Thomas like a slap. In 25 years of flying, passengers didn't say no to him. They apologized, they explained, they pleaded, but they didn't refuse direct orders from the captain. I said, "Let me see that phone." And I said no. James's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it now. "Captain, I suggest you take a step back and think very carefully about your next move." Thomas felt his control of the situation slipping away. The passengers were watching, recording, judging. His first officer was questioning his decisions. His senior flight attendant had refused to follow his orders. And now this passenger, this man who'd started as a minor annoyance, was refusing to submit to his authority. Thomas made the decision that would end his career. "Airport security to Gate A17, he called on his radio. "I have a disruptive passenger who's threatening crew members and needs to be removed immediately." The die was cast. The airport security officers arrived at Gate A17 within 4 minutes of Thomas Mitchell's call. Mike Rodriguez, a 10-year veteran of Miami-Dade Airport security, and Dave Johnson, a former police officer who'd transferred to airport duty after a knee injury, ended his patrol career. They'd responded to hundreds of passenger disputes, and both men had learned to approach these situations with caution, since airline crew members sometimes exaggerated minor conflicts into major security threats. "What's the problem here?" Mike asked, his voice professional but neutral. He looked around the gate area, noting the crowd of passengers with phones out, the obvious tension between the captain and the passenger, and the fact that nobody appeared to be in physical danger. Thomas stepped forward, his uniform giving him an air of authority that both officers instinctively respected. "Officers, I need this individual removed from the gate area. He's been disruptive, hostile toward crew members, and he's refused to comply with security screening procedures." Mike looked at James Rivera, who was standing quietly with his hands visible and his boarding pass in his hand. "Sir, what's your side of this?" I haven't been disruptive or hostile, James replied calmly. I've answered all the captain's questions, provided identification when requested, and followed all airline procedures. The only issue seems to be that Captain Mitchell doesn't believe I should be allowed to board the flight. Dave pulled out his notebook. Let me get some basic information. Name James Rivera, and you have a ticket for this flight. James handed over his boarding pass. Dave examined it, noting that everything appeared to be in order: proper passenger name, correct flight number, valid seat assignment. Captain Dave said, turning back to Thomas, "What specific airline policy did Mr. Rivera violate?" Thomas felt a moment of panic. In his anger, he'd called security without actually thinking through the justification for his actions. James hadn't violated any written policies. He hadn't been loud, threatening, or uncooperative. His only offense had been not showing the level of deference that Thomas expected from economy passengers. He was blocking priority boarding areas, Thomas said, grasping for legitimate grounds. And when I asked him to move, he became argumentative and hostile. I moved when asked, James pointed out quietly. And I haven't raised my voice once during this entire conversation. Mike looked around the gate area where dozens of passengers were still recording the interaction. Does anyone here witness Mr. Rivera being argumentative or hostile? Several passengers shook their heads. Maria Lopez called out from her position near the boarding counter. He's been totally polite the whole time. The captain's been the one getting aggressive. Robert Wilson stepped forward. Officer, I'm an attorney, and I've been watching this entire interaction. Mr. Rivera has been cooperative throughout. This appears to be a case of harassment based on racial profiling. Thomas felt the situation spiraling completely out of control. These passengers don't understand airline security procedures. I'm the captain, and I have the authority to refuse boarding to anyone I consider a security risk. Based on what Dave asked bluntly, what specific actions or statements made you consider Mr. Rivera a security risk? Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but he realized he had no answer. Everything he'd done had been based on assumptions, prejudices, and a gut feeling that James didn't belong on his aircraft. None of that would sound legitimate to security officers who dealt with real threats on a daily basis. While Thomas struggled to find justification for his actions, James Rivera was receiving a text message on his business phone that would change everything. ETA 3 minutes. Executive team deploying. James looked toward the main terminal corridor where he could see a group of people in business attire walking rapidly toward the gate area. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of corporate executives responding to a crisis, and passengers instinctively stepped aside to let them pass. The delegation was led by Patricia Hayes, CEO of Atlantic Airways, a woman whose rise through the airline industry had been marked by her ability to solve problems quickly and decisively. Behind her walked Michael Torres, the company's legal director, Angela Foster, head of corporate security, and 2 other executives whose job titles were less important than their ability to implement immediate solutions to corporate disasters. Thomas noticed the approaching group but didn't recognize any of them. In 25 years of flying for Atlantic Airways, he'd attended exactly 3 company meetings, and he'd never interacted with anyone above the level of regional operations manager. The idea that these well-dressed executives might be connected to the passenger dispute he was handling never occurred to him. Patricia Hayes reached gate A17 and immediately assessed the situation with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 15 years managing airline crises. She saw the security officers, the captain, in the middle of what was obviously a heated discussion, the passenger standing calmly with his boarding pass, and the dozens of phones recording everything for social media posterity. More importantly, she recognized James Rivera. "Captain Mitchell, Patricia," said her voice cutting through the conversation like a blade. "You're relieved of duty. Effective immediately." Thomas turned toward the voice, confusion evident on his face. He'd never seen this woman before, had no idea who she was or why she thought she had authority over his decisions. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Patricia Hayes, CEO of Atlantic Airways," she replied, producing her corporate identification. And you, Captain Mitchell, have just created the biggest public relations disaster in this company's history." The gate area fell silent. Even the background noise of the airport seemed to fade as passengers processed what they were hearing. The CEO of the airline had just appeared at the gate and fired the captain in front of everyone. Thomas stared at the identification card, his mind struggling to process what was happening. There must be some mistake. I was handling a security situation with a disruptive passenger. The only mistake was yours, Patricia replied coldly. She turned to James Rivera, her expression shifting to one of professional concern and personal embarrassment. "Mr. Rivera, I apologize profusely for this incident. This is not how Atlantic Airways treats our customers, and it's certainly not how we treat you." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. The way Patricia was speaking to James with a level of deference that went beyond normal customer service recovery suggested that this wasn't just any passenger. "I don't understand," Thomas said quietly. Michael Torres stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years dealing with legal crises. "Captain Mitchell, allow me to explain. The passenger you've been harassing, James Rivera, is the chairman of Skyline Aviation Holdings, the company that owns 89% of Atlantic Airways. He's not just a customer. He's your boss." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He looked at James Rivera, seeing him clearly for the first time, the quiet confidence, the expensive watch barely visible beneath his sleeve, the way he'd remained calm throughout an interaction that would have angered most people beyond reason. "That's impossible," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. Angela Foster opened her tablet and turned it toward Thomas, displaying James Rivera's corporate profile. Chairman and CEO of Skyline Aviation Holdings, net worth $1.2 billion, owner of the largest private aviation company in North America, and majority shareholder in Atlantic Airways. "Mr. Rivera purchased this airline 90 days ago," Angela explained. "The acquisition hasn't been announced publicly yet, but every member of senior management was briefed on his importance to our company. Apparently, that briefing didn't reach the flight operations level." Thomas felt his knees go weak. He'd spent the last hour publicly humiliating the man who owned the airline, who controlled his paycheck, who could end his career with a single decision. Every word he'd spoken, every assumption he'd made, every moment of aggression had been directed at someone who had the power to destroy him completely. "Mr. Rivera Thomas," said his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I had no idea who you were." James looked at Thomas with an expression that was neither angry nor sympathetic. "That's exactly the problem, Captain. You treated me the way you did because you didn't know who I was. But how I should be treated shouldn't depend on my title or my net worth. It should depend on basic human dignity." Patricia Hayes turned to address the crowd of passengers who were still recording everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to personally apologize for what you've witnessed tonight. The behavior you've seen from Captain Mitchell does not represent the values or standards of Atlantic Airways. We will be conducting a full investigation, and we will be implementing immediate changes to ensure that no passenger ever experiences this kind of treatment again." She paused, looking directly into several of the phones that were broadcasting live to social media audiences. "To those of you who are sharing this story online, I ask that you include this message. Atlantic Airways is committed to treating every passenger with respect and dignity regardless of their appearance, background, or ticket class. What happened here tonight was wrong, and we will make it right." Carlos Medina had been watching the entire scene unfold with a mixture of horror and fascination. As Thomas's first officer, he'd known that his captain's behavior was problematic, but he'd never imagined it would lead to this kind of corporate intervention. Now, he found himself wondering about his own career prospects since he'd been complicit in the confrontation by not speaking up more forcefully. Patricia turned to Carlos. "Mr. Medina, you're now the captain of this flight. Do you feel prepared to handle that responsibility?" Carlos straightened his shoulders. "Yes, ma'am. I'm ready." "Good. Your first decision as captain is what to do about tonight's passenger list. Mr. Rivera has experienced significant harassment, and he may not feel comfortable continuing with his travel plans. James looked around the gate area at the passengers who'd witnessed his humiliation, at the crew members who'd watched their captain abuse his authority, at the corporate executives who'd rushed to clean up a mess that could have been avoided with basic human decency. "I'll be taking the flight," James said quietly. "Seat 24E as originally planned." Patricia looked surprised. "Mr. Rivera, we can arrange for private transportation or delay your travel until tomorrow if you prefer." "No," James replied firmly. "I came here to see how Atlantic Airways treats its passengers. I've seen that. Now I want to see how we're going to do better." Thomas Mitchell was escorted from the gate area by airport security, not as a law enforcement action, but as a corporate security measure. His airline identification was confiscated, his access to company computers was immediately revoked, and his personal belongings were collected from the crew room under supervision. As he walked through the terminal, still wearing his captain's uniform but no longer entitled to the authority it represented, Thomas felt the weight of every assumption he'd made, every prejudice he'd acted on, every moment when he'd chosen power over decency. He'd lost more than a job. He'd lost his identity, his financial security, and his professional reputation. But most importantly, he'd lost the opportunity to learn something that James Rivera had tried to teach him, that respect is something you give to everyone, not something you withhold until they prove they deserve it. The Boeing 757 pushed back from the gate 37 minutes late, with Carlos Medina in the left seat and a relief first officer who'd been called in from home. The passenger manifest showed James Rivera in seat 24E, exactly where he'd planned to sit from the beginning. As the aircraft lifted off from Miami International Airport, climbing into the Florida night sky, James looked out the small economy window and thought about the conversations that would happen tomorrow with Atlantic Airways employees who needed to understand that customer service was a core value, not an optional courtesy, with industry leaders who needed to see that change was coming whether they embraced it or not, with passengers who deserved to travel with dignity regardless of their appearance or ticket class. The transformation of Atlantic Airways would begin tomorrow, but the transformation of Thomas Mitchell had already ended tonight. The Atlantic Airways Boeing 757 cruised at 39,000 feet over the Georgia mountains, but the real turbulence was happening in corporate boardrooms, legal offices, and social media feeds across the country. The video footage from Gate A17 had already been viewed more than 2 million times across various platforms, with Atlantic Airways racism trending #1 on Twitter and major news outlets picking up the story for their morning broadcasts. In the first-class cabin, Patricia Hayes was conducting damage control via satellite phone with Atlantic Airways' public relations team, while Michael Torres reviewed the legal implications of Thomas Mitchell's actions with the company's outside counsel. The consensus was clear: this was going to be expensive, embarrassing, and potentially catastrophic for the airline's reputation unless they acted quickly and decisively. James Rivera sat in seat 24E, the middle seat in economy that he'd deliberately chosen to experience Atlantic Airways from a passenger's perspective. He was reviewing a comprehensive report on his tablet that detailed 6 months of similar incidents across the airline's route network. Passengers questioned about their right to be in premium cabins. Travelers subjected to additional screening based on appearance rather than behavior. Crew members who'd learned to see certain passengers as problems to be managed rather than customers to be served. The data painted a clear picture of an organizational culture that had prioritized authority over accountability, creating an environment where employees like Thomas Mitchell could act on their prejudices without fear of consequences. That culture was about to change dramatically. Carlos Medina announced their descent into Denver International Airport with a voice that carried new confidence and authority. His promotion from first officer to captain had happened in the most dramatic circumstances possible, but he was determined to prove himself worthy of the responsibility. As he guided the aircraft through the approach procedures, Carlos thought about the conversation he'd had with James Rivera during the cruise portion of the flight. "Why didn't you identify yourself earlier?" Carlos had asked during a brief break from cockpit duties. James had looked up from his tablet, considering the question carefully. Because the problem wasn't about me personally, he'd replied. It was about how your airline treats people who look like me. If I'd announced my identity at the beginning, Captain Mitchell would have changed his behavior, but he wouldn't have learned anything. More importantly, I wouldn't have documented the real experience that our regular passengers face. But you knew this would end his career, Carlos had pointed out. Captain Mitchell ended his own career, James had corrected. I just gave him the opportunity to show who he really was. The question now is whether the rest of your crew is going to learn from his mistake or repeat it. The aircraft touched down in Denver at 11:47 p.m. Mountain Time, 3 hours and 12 minutes after the scheduled arrival. The delay had been caused by the incident at Miami, but none of the passengers complained. Word had spread through the cabin about what had happened at the gate, and there was a sense that they'd all witnessed something historically significant. As passengers deplaned, many stopped to thank James Rivera for his dignity during the confrontation. Maria Lopez, the teacher who'd live-streamed the entire incident, told him that her video had been shared by civil rights organizations, aviation industry groups, and news outlets around the world. "You changed something tonight," she said. "Not just for this airline, but for all of them." Robert Wilson, the attorney, handed James his business card. "If you need any legal support for what comes next, please call me." What happened tonight was a clear violation of federal civil rights laws, and Thomas Mitchell should face criminal charges, not just employment consequences. Jennifer Adams, the college student, showed James her phone where her TikTok video had reached 4.2 million views. "My generation doesn't tolerate this kind of behavior," she said. "Airlines need to know that we're watching, and we're not going to let them get away with treating people badly." By the time James reached the terminal, the story had already dominated 3 news cycles. CNN had interviewed civil rights attorneys about racial profiling in commercial aviation. Fox News had run a segment on airline captain authority and passenger rights. MSNBC had connected the incident to broader patterns of discrimination in the transportation industry. More importantly for Atlantic Airways, their corporate customer service phone lines had been overwhelmed with calls from passengers threatening to boycott the airline unless dramatic changes were implemented immediately. Social media managers were working around the clock to respond to thousands of negative comments, and the company's stock price had dropped 12% in after-hours trading. Thomas Mitchell's downfall was swift and comprehensive. By the time the flight landed in Denver, he'd been terminated from Atlantic Airways with cause, meaning he lost not only his job, but also his pension benefits, health insurance, and professional references. The Federal Aviation Administration launched an investigation into his conduct with the possibility of permanent revocation of his airline transport pilot certificate. The criminal investigation was more serious. The Miami-Dade District Attorney's Office announced that they were reviewing the incident for possible civil rights violations, false imprisonment, and abuse of authority. Federal prosecutors indicated they might pursue charges under airline safety regulations that made it a crime to interfere with passenger transportation without legitimate cause. Thomas's personal life collapsed as quickly as his professional career. His ex-wife filed paperwork to increase his alimony obligations, claiming that his misconduct had damaged her reputation by association. His apartment lease was terminated when his landlord saw the viral videos and decided he didn't want a racist pilot as a tenant. His car was repossessed when he missed the first payment after losing his job. But the most devastating blow came from his own industry. Pilots across the aviation community, including many who'd previously defended Thomas's aggressive management style, publicly condemned his actions. The Airline Pilots Association issued a statement distancing itself from his behavior. Other airlines quietly added his name to their do not hire databases, ensuring that he'd never fly commercially again. Within 72 hours, Thomas Mitchell went from being a senior airline captain to an unemployed, unemployable pariah, whose face was recognizable to millions of people as a symbol of workplace racism. Atlantic Airways' response was unprecedented in its scope and speed. Patricia Hayes announced a comprehensive overhaul of the airline's culture, beginning with mandatory training for all employees on customer service unconscious bias and professional conduct. The training wasn't a brief online module, but a full-day workshop conducted by external experts in civil rights and organizational psychology. More significantly, the airline implemented what they called the Rivera Protocol, a set of policies designed to ensure that no passenger would ever again face the kind of treatment James had experienced. The protocol required crew members to document any passenger interaction that involved questioning someone's right to be on a flight with automatic review by corporate supervisors for any incident involving possible discrimination. The financial commitment was substantial $50 million allocated to enhanced training, customer service improvements, and a compensation fund for passengers who'd experienced discrimination on Atlantic Airways flights. An additional $25 million was set aside for diversity and inclusion. Initiatives including scholarships for aspiring pilots from underrepresented communities and partnerships with historically black colleges and universities. James Rivera used the incident as a catalyst for industry-wide change. As the owner of Atlantic Airways and chairman of Skyline Aviation Holdings, he had the influence to push for reforms that went far beyond a single airline. He announced the creation of the Aviation Equality Initiative, a coalition of airlines' pilot organizations and civil rights groups committed to eliminating discrimination in commercial aviation. The initiative's first action was to establish a database for reporting discriminatory incidents across all major airlines, with standardized investigation procedures and public reporting of results. Airlines that participated would receive preferred status with corporate travel departments and government contracts. Airlines that refused would face coordinated pressure from civil rights organizations and social media campaigns. The Department of Transportation, responding to public pressure generated by the viral videos, announced new regulations requiring airlines to provide quarterly reports on passenger complaints related to discrimination. The regulations also mandated that airline employees receive annual training on civil rights laws and that companies face significant financial penalties for patterns of discriminatory behavior. Industry analysts predicted that the changes would cost airlines hundreds of millions of dollars in training compliance and operational modifications. But they also noted that the cost of inaction could be even higher, as passengers increasingly chose airlines based on their reputation for treating customers fairly. 6 months after the incident at Gate A17, the transformation of Atlantic Airways was visible throughout the company. Customer satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. Employee morale had improved significantly, and the airline's reputation had recovered to the point where it was being featured in business schools as a case study in crisis management and cultural change. Lisa Thompson was promoted to Director of Cabin Services, making her responsible for training flight attendants across the entire Atlantic Airways fleet. Her first initiative was to implement a program where crew members were evaluated not just on safety procedures, but on their ability to make passengers feel welcome and respected regardless of their appearance or ticket class. Sofia Martinez became the airline's Customer Experience Manager, a newly created position that gave her authority to resolve passenger complaints in real time and implement policy changes based on feedback from travelers. Her team monitored social media for mentions of Atlantic Airways, responding immediately to any reports of poor service or discriminatory treatment. Carlos Medina thrived as a captain, developing a reputation for professionalism and passenger advocacy that made him one of the most requested pilots in the Atlantic Airways fleet. He used his position to mentor young Hispanic pilots and advocate for diversity in airline hiring practices. The industry changes rippled far beyond Atlantic Airways. Other airlines, recognizing that viral videos could destroy decades of brand building in a matter of hours, implemented similar training programs and customer service reforms. The era of airline employees treating passengers as problems to be managed was ending, replaced by a culture that recognized customer service as essential to long-term profitability. Civil rights organizations noted a significant decrease in discrimination complaints against airlines, while passenger advocacy groups reported that travelers felt more confident about reporting poor treatment because they knew their complaints would be taken seriously. The legal consequences for Thomas Mitchell continued to unfold over the following months. He pled guilty to federal civil rights violations in exchange for a suspended sentence and 2 years of probation, during which he was required to perform community service with organizations dedicated to fighting racism. His FAA certification was permanently revoked, ending any possibility of a return to commercial aviation. He found work as a shift supervisor for a logistics company in New Jersey, a position that paid less than 1/5 of his former captain's salary and offered none of the prestige he'd once enjoyed. Colleagues who recognized him from the viral videos were polite but distant, and he spent most of his time alone reviewing shipping manifests and trying to avoid conversations about his past. But the most profound change was in Thomas himself. Stripped of the uniform that had defined his identity for 25 years, forced to confront the reality of his actions and their consequences, he began to understand what James Rivera had tried to tell him that night at Gate A-17, that respect is something you give to everyone, not something you withhold until they prove they deserve it. In a letter to James Rivera that he wrote but never sent, Thomas reflected on the lessons he'd learned too late. I spent 25 years believing that my uniform made me better than the people I served. I was wrong about everything. You tried to show me that dignity doesn't depend on appearance or status or power, but I was too arrogant to listen. I hope the changes you've made will prevent other people from making the same mistakes I made. I hope other captains will learn what I should have known from the beginning, that every passenger deserves to be treated like a human being, regardless of what they look like or where they're sitting on the plane. The letter remained in Thomas's apartment, a private acknowledgement of truths he'd discovered too late to save his career, but not too late to change his character. 1 year after the incident at Gate A-17, James Rivera stood in the boardroom of Atlantic Airways headquarters in Miami, looking out at the city where his confrontation with Thomas Mitchell had changed the trajectory of an entire industry. The room was filled with airline executives, civil rights leaders, and employee representatives who'd gathered for the first annual Aviation Equality Summit, an event that had grown from James's initial vision into a movement that was reshaping commercial aviation. The transformation had been more profound than anyone could have anticipated. Atlantic Airways had gone from being a case study in workplace discrimination to a model for inclusive customer service. Employee satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements in workplace culture, while passenger ratings had reached levels that other airlines struggled to match. Most importantly, the number of discrimination complaints had dropped to nearly zero, not because passengers had stopped reporting problems, but because the problems themselves had largely disappeared. Patricia Hayes took the podium to address the assembled crowd. 12 months ago, our company faced the darkest moment in its history. A passenger was publicly humiliated by one of our employees, recorded by dozens of witnesses and broadcast to millions of people around the world. We could have seen that as the end of our reputation. Instead, Mr. Rivera helped us see it as the beginning of our transformation. She paused, looking toward James, who was sitting in the front row next to Carlos Medina, now a senior captain and representative for the Hispanic Pilots Association. The changes we've implemented haven't been easy, and they haven't been cheap. But they've been worth every dollar and every hour of effort because they've reminded us why we exist to serve people, all people with dignity and respect. Carlos stepped to the microphone, his captain's uniform now bearing 4 stripes that he'd earned through competence rather than privilege. I was there that night, he said, his voice carrying across the room. I watched a good man get treated badly by someone who thought his position gave him the right to judge people by their appearance. I was ashamed that I didn't speak up sooner, but I learned something that night that changed my entire approach to this job. He looked directly at James. You could have identified yourself at any point during that confrontation. You could have ended Captain Mitchell's harassment with a single phone call, but you didn't because you understood that the problem wasn't about how James Rivera was being treated. It was about how any passenger who looked like James Rivera might be treated. You let yourself be humiliated so that other people wouldn't have to experience the same thing. The room fell silent as Carlos continued. That's what real leadership looks like. Not the kind that demands respect because of rank or authority, but the kind that earns respect by standing up for people who can't defend themselves. James walked to the front of the room, accepting the microphone with the same quiet dignity he'd shown that night at Gate A17. He looked out at the audience airline employees who'd changed their approach to customer service passengers, who'd found the courage to speak up against discrimination industry leaders, who'd recognized that treating people fairly wasn't just morally right, but financially smart. When I sat in that economy seat, James said I wasn't thinking about changing an industry. I was thinking about my mother, who worked 2 jobs to keep us fed and housed, and who taught me that respect isn't something you earn by accumulating wealth or titles. It's something you give to everyone you meet, because that's what human beings deserve. His voice carried the weight of personal experience and hard-won wisdom. Captain Mitchell made a mistake that night, but he wasn't the only one. For too long, all of us in this industry accepted that some passengers would be treated poorly because of how they looked or where they sat on the plane. We told ourselves that was just how the business worked, that customer service was secondary to operational efficiency. James paused, looking around the room at faces that represented every level of the aviation industry. What we learned is that treating people with dignity isn't expensive. It doesn't require new equipment or complex procedures. It just requires remembering that every passenger is someone's mother or father, son or daughter, someone who deserves to travel without fear of being humiliated or harassed. He stepped closer to the audience, his voice becoming more personal. I want to share something that Thomas Mitchell wrote to me in a letter he never sent, but that he shared with a counselor as part of his community service requirement. James pulled out a folded piece of paper. He said, I spent 25 years believing that my uniform made me better than the people I served. You tried to show me that dignity doesn't depend on appearance or status or power, but I was too arrogant to listen. The room was completely quiet as James continued reading. I hope the changes you've made will prevent other people from making the same mistakes I made. I hope other captains will learn what I should have known from the beginning, that every passenger deserves to be treated like a human being. James folded the letter carefully. Thomas Mitchell lost his career because he forgot something fundamental about human nature. But in losing his career, he found his humanity. And maybe that's the real lesson here. It's never too late to learn how to treat people better. As the summit concluded, participants scattered to airports across the country, carrying with them new policies, fresh perspectives, and a renewed commitment to making commercial aviation a place where everyone could travel with dignity. The changes they implemented would touch millions of passengers over the coming years, preventing countless incidents of discrimination and harassment. James Rivera returned to seat 24E on his flight home, not because he had to, but because he chose to. As the aircraft climbed into the evening sky, he thought about the journey that had brought him from a poor kid in Detroit to the owner of multiple airlines, and about the responsibility that came with that success. Looking out the small economy window at the lights of Miami disappearing below, James reflected on a truth that had taken him 44 years to fully understand. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay exactly where you belong and make the world change around you. The flight attendant, a young woman named Maria, who'd been hired as part of Atlantic Airways' diversity initiative, stopped by his seat. Mr. Rivera, can I get you anything? I'm fine, thank you, James replied with a smile. Just enjoying the ride. She nodded and moved on to the next passenger, treating them with the same courtesy and respect she'd shown him, because that was now the standard at Atlantic Airways. It was a small moment, unremarkable in itself, but it represented something larger. A culture where passenger dignity wasn't negotiable, where respect was given freely rather than earned through status, where the color of someone's skin or the price of their ticket didn't determine how they were treated. That was Thomas Mitchell's real legacy, not the career he destroyed through prejudice, but the industry he inadvertently helped transform through his failure. And that was James Rivera's victory. Not the humiliation of one bigoted pilot, but the elevation of millions of passengers who would never know his name, but would benefit from his quiet courage on a difficult night in Miami. Sometimes justice doesn't come with fanfare or celebration. Sometimes it comes in the form of respectful service fare treatment and the simple acknowledgement that every person who steps onto an airplane deserves to arrive at their destination with their dignity intact. The revolution in commercial aviation had begun with a single word: no. James Rivera's refusal to be intimidated, humiliated, or silenced. And it would continue with millions of small acts of respect, kindness, and human decency at 39,000 feet. If this story moved you, I want you to do something important. Hit that like button right now to show your support for dignity and respect in every interaction. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because we're bringing you more powerful stories of justice and courage every single week. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between speaking up and staying silent? Drop your story in the comments below. Let's build a community where everyone's voice matters and everyone's dignity is protected. Remember, you never know who you're talking to, but more importantly, it shouldn't matter. Every person deserves respect, kindness, and basic human decency. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story where quiet strength changes everything.